Critical Depth submerged itself into your PlayStation disc drive back in 1997 and was the first vehicular combat game that developer Singletrac made after handing the Twisted Metal franchise over to Sony first-party development. That's right, the guys that literally created the car combat genre are the guys behind Critical Depth. Even the back of the box seems proud of this by boldly stating it's from the developers who know vehicular combat. And I mean, who could really argue with that, because these guys were essentially the OG pimps of car combat. So does Critical Depth carry on their legacy with another great game? Or does it implode under thousands of pounds of pressure to make a game that was just as good or better than Twisted Metal 2? Jumping into Critical Depth, you're treated to a brief cinematic that tries its best to create a story that justifies why everyone is fighting it out underwater in crazy tricked-out submarines. Of course, the answer is alien technology that's apparently been discovered by a submersible, and is then sought after by every explorer on Earth that's capable of getting their asses underwater. Honestly, it really doesn't make any difference at all, as I think by this point we've relegated car combat storylines to something like packing foam. It's just there to pad things out and hopefully doesn't get in the way of blowing shit up. Actually, I wouldn't even mention it, but you do get to see this scene at the end of the video that makes it entirely worth your time.
There.
Once you're done laughing at that guy's face being sucked off, it's time to get into the game proper, and there's no denying that Critical Depth is at the very least a unique entry into the vehicular combat scene. The game tosses the whole battling in cars and land right out the window, and goes for hot submarine on submarine action that takes place in the deep sea. That's right, every character you pick is piloting a sub, and is no longer bound by the boring physics of being on land. This definitely makes the game feel completely different from any other car combat game out there, as you now have the freedom of full 360-degree movement on every axis. Instead of just being able to attack opponents head-on, you now get the ability to come at anything and everyone at any angle. It was a totally fresh idea in a genre that was already getting old just a year in. Besides a completely unique setting and controls, the game isn't that much different from the rest of the car combat games out there. If you've watched the last few videos, then you already know how this works. Pick some insane character that's somehow allowed to pilot a submarine for some reason, and then do battle in an arena setting full of other people that want to kill you. You'll be picking up various weapons around the map to fire at your opponents, along with having your own unique super weapon that recharges over time. Yes, this is Car Combat 101, just under the sea. Critical Depth does try to mix things up a bit by tossing out the whole last man standing to win gameplay of other car combat games, and instead uses alien pods that have to be collected by the player before you can open up the exit to the stage. Each pod also gives you stuff like armor boosts or weapon power-ups when collected, so having 3 or more pods in your possession can make the person holding them almost unstoppable. Still though, it does at least make for some intense battles as you try to get to the pods first, or damage enemies enough to make them drop the pods they've already collected. It's a fun idea, but besides that, there's not much to separate Critical Depth from the rest of the pack in terms of gameplay. And if it also looks incredibly similar to the other Twisted Metal games despite the setting, then you'd be right. Singletrac used the same 3D engine from Twisted Metal to power Critical Depth, which makes the game seem way more familiar than it should in terms of overly twitchy movement, crappy camera angles, and almost complete absence of actual physics that Twisted Metal 1 and 2 also had in abundance. And that brings with it the worst problem of Critical Depth. The combination of the underwater setting and the Twisted Metal engine just doesn't mix well. To be frank, the game just feels super janky. Everything from the movement of your sub to the combat feels just, well, off. The first big issue is the speed of the game. Due to being underwater, movement is slowed considerably from the twitch-based action of Twisted Metal. Hell, even Vigilante 8 feels faster paced than Critical Depth. And if you're saying, well, duh, it's set underwater, well, I get that. But this isn't a submarine sim, and it's just a bit too slow for something that's literally trying to sell itself as Twisted Metal underwater. Even the game itself seems to know it's too slow since there's actually a fast toggle in the options menu. But that just ends up making things feel even more awkward since the game was obviously never designed to be fast-paced in the first place. Where it was always super fun to power slide around levels in Twisted Metal, Critical Depth turns the act of getting around into a boring slog until you can finally find a group of enemies to shoot at. Sadly, things get even worse from there on out. Once you finally get into some action, you'll find that the combat feels just as weird as the movement does. Since the maps are so open, most of the ships will gather in one spot and duke it out in one huge clump of seizure-inducing chaos. Getting close will probably see your sub decimated in seconds, and since most stages have very little in the way of obstacles that you can use to escape or hide behind, you'll find yourself being hounded constantly. You do get a shield that you can use, but it rarely outlasts the barrage of crap that's continually coming from you if you get near enemy vessels. This turns most matches into a long-range affair, as you'll constantly be trying to hide until you can get enough weapons to unload into an enemy at a distance to do some massive chunk damage, and then swim away as fast as possible in the hope that someone else doesn't do the same to you. It makes each round feel like a cat-and-mouse scenario, striking when the time is right and then retreating instantly. And while that's fairly unique in the car combat universe, it's just not very fun if you're expecting the insane action of Twisted Metal. There's definitely a slower, more methodical pace to Critical Depth that would probably be more at home in a flight sim. And that may well appeal to some people, but for me personally, I'll take the faster pace of other car combat games over this any day. As already mentioned, the stages are one of the reasons Critical Depth falls flat. Not only do most of them look the exact same, since they're all just essentially different shades of blue, there's barely anything else in them that makes them stand out. Most are huge expanses of water with nothing in the way of landmarks or obstacles for long stretches. And the ones that do try to mix it up, like the stage set in the underwater caves, makes the act of finding enemies a huge chore. There are, of course, the standard assortment of stage secrets to find, but exploring never feels fun, since your sub control's so awkward that you'll probably just avoid most of them. This seems like a missed opportunity for the game, since the setting could have made for some amazing stages. Instead, we're stuck with arenas that feel less exciting and imaginative than a fish tank at Walmart. I may seem really down on Critical Depth, but in all honesty, I really appreciate what Singletrac was trying to do here, even if it didn't quite hit the mark. Instead of following up Twisted Metal with yet another cookie-cutter car combat experience, they took the genre in a whole new direction. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work out that well. While it's initially fun to be battling it out underneath the sea and refreshing to pilot your sub in any direction, it just isn't fun enough to keep you coming back. But if you find that other car combat games are a bit too fast and crazy for you, then you might actually really get into Critical Depth. It's definitely got its own unique thing going for it, and I know more than a few people that really enjoy it. It's definitely worth checking out, just being a weird curiosity in a genre that never tried too hard to shake things up at all. In the end, Critical Depth may have been a disappointment as the follow-up to Twisted Metal 2, but it's still worth trying out if you're a fan of the genre, or just want to see what Singletrac was doing after Twisted Metal and Jet Moto. So strap yourself into your favorite sub if you want something a little different. And who knows, Critical Depth may just pull you down to its depths and refuse to let you surface.